My sister cracked my wrist. Dad whispered, "Don't report her. She has her whole life ahead of her." I remember the cold of the kitchen tile against my cheek before I remember the pain. That's strange, isn't it? You'd think the pain would come first, but what I remember is the cold and the sound of my own breathing, shallow and fast, and my father's knees cracking as he lowered himself down next to me. My wrist was bent in a way wrists are not supposed to bend. I could see it without turning my head, just at the edge of my vision, twisted like a broken branch. And while I lay there waiting for an ambulance that felt like it was taking 100 years to arrive, my father leaned in close, so close I could feel his breath on my ear, and he whispered the words that would end our relationship forever. "Please, don't tell the police she did it. She has her whole life ahead of her." I was 27 years old, lying on my parents' kitchen floor with a shattered wrist, and my father's first instinct was not to comfort me. It was to protect the person who had broken me. To understand how I ended up on that floor, you have to understand who we were as a family, or at least who we pretended to be. I was the younger of 2 children. Responsible, quiet, the kind of kid who did her homework without being asked and never wanted to cause trouble. I built a career I was proud of, paid my own bills, and still found time every week to check in on my parents, to help them with whatever they needed, financial or otherwise. My sister was 3 years older than me. She was by every outward measure the golden child, charming when she wanted to be, the center of every room, but underneath the charm was something harder, something that had been there since we were kids, a temper that flared without warning and a habit of getting exactly what she wanted, no matter who had to bend to make that happen. When we were children, she broke my toys when she was jealous of them. She took money from my piggy bank and blamed me when it went missing. She lied to our parents about things I never did, and I got punished for them while she watched, smiling from the hallway. There was physical bullying too. A shove down the stairs I still remember, a book thrown at my head hard enough to leave a mark, and every single time my parents had the same response. "She's just emotional. You're the stronger one. Be the bigger person." I heard those phrases so many times growing up that they stopped sounding like excuses and started sounding like truth. I actually believed for years that keeping the peace was my responsibility, that my job in this family was to absorb the damage so nobody else had to. I told myself this was maturity. I told myself this was love. I was wrong on both counts, but it would take a broken wrist and a shattered image of my father for me to understand that. As adults, the dynamic didn't change. It just got more expensive. My sister struggled to hold down a job. She drifted between short-lived positions, each one ending in some dramatic falling out that was never, according to her fault. She lived with our parents well into her 30s, contributing little, expecting much. And I was always there to fill the gaps. I paid for a hospital bill when my mother's insurance came up short. I covered 2 mortgage payments during a rough patch. I bailed my sister out of financial trouble more times than I could count, quietly, without complaint, because that's what a good daughter did. That's what I had been trained to do since I was 6 years old. The year everything fell apart started with a simple phone call. My parents needed another loan, not a small one. I sat with the number for a long time, thinking about everything I had already given, everything I had sacrificed while my sister gave nothing. And for the first time in my life, I said no. The silence on the other end of the phone was heavier than any argument could have been. My parents were disappointed in me, not concerned about their finances, disappointed in me, specifically, for finally setting a boundary. Word got back to my sister quickly, the way it always did in our family, and she wasted no time turning it into a weapon. I was selfish. I thought money made me better than everyone else. I was abandoning the family in their time of need. None of it was true, but truth had never mattered much in the story my family told about me. The explosion happened on a Sunday, at what was supposed to be a normal family dinner. I don't even remember what started the argument. Something small, something that shouldn't have mattered. But it grew, the way these things always grew, until my sister was screaming across the table and I decided I'd had enough. I stood up to leave. She got to the doorway before I did. I asked her to move. She didn't. I tried to step around her, and that's when she grabbed my arm, hard enough to bruise, and shoved me with the full weight of her body. I lost my footing. I remember reaching out instinctively to catch myself, and instead of catching myself, my wrist took the entire fall. There was a sound I will never forget. A sharp, wet crack like a branch snapping in a storm, and then there was the floor, cold beneath my cheek, and the world narrowing down to a single point of unbearable pain. My sister froze in the doorway, staring down at me like she couldn't quite believe what her own body had just done. My mother screamed. My father, to his credit, at least had the presence of mind to call the ambulance. But it was in those minutes of waiting, kneeling beside me on the floor, that he whispered the words that told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in this family. At the hospital, the diagnosis was worse than I expected. A severe fracture, torn ligaments, surgery would be required, followed by months of recovery, and the doctors couldn't promise I'd ever regain full strength in that wrist again. I lay in that hospital bed absorbing the news, and somewhere in the middle of it, a police officer walked in to take a routine statement, the kind that gets filed whenever an injury like mine comes through the emergency room. Before I could say a single word, my father leaned over the hospital bed and whispered it again. "Please, don't ruin her future." My mother was crying into a tissue in the corner of the room. My sister stood near the door, silent, letting our parents do the begging for her, letting them absorb the discomfort of the moment while she said nothing, took no responsibility, offered no apology. Nobody in that room asked how I was feeling. Nobody asked if I was in pain. The only concern anyone voiced was for my sister's future, as if my own future, my ability to use my hand, to work, to live without chronic pain, meant nothing at all. I looked at my father. I looked at my mother. I looked at my sister standing there with her arms crossed, refusing to meet my eyes. And for the first time in 27 years, I stopped absorbing the damage. I turned to the officer and told the truth. "Yes, she pushed me." He wrote it down. A report was filed, and with those 4 words, I set off a chain of events that would tear my family apart. Not because I broke it, but because I finally refused to be the one holding it together with my own broken bones. The backlash came fast, and it came ugly. Extended relatives I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly had strong opinions about my character. Messages flooded in from aunts, uncles, cousins, people who hadn't been in that kitchen, hadn't seen the shove, hadn't heard the crack of my wrist against the floor. Families don't involve the police, they told me. It was an accident, they insisted, despite having no idea what actually happened. Drop the charges. You'll destroy her life. Nobody once asked about mine. My parents stopped speaking to me almost entirely. What little contact remained was cold, transactional, dripping with resentment. Social media whispers reached me through mutual friends, posts that never named me directly but painted a picture clear enough for anyone who knew our family. The narrator, apparently, was the villain of this story. My sister, in the meantime, had constructed her own version of events. She told anyone who would listen that I had simply slipped, that the police report was nothing more than revenge, a petty attempt to punish her for years of imagined slights. I started to doubt myself. That's the insidious thing about this kind of manipulation. It doesn't just come from one person, it comes from an entire system of people reinforcing the same lie until you start to wonder if you're the one who's lost touch with reality. I replayed the moment over and over. Had I imagined the shove? Had I somehow caused my own fall? I knew, logically, that I hadn't. But knowing something logically and believing it in your bones after a lifetime of being told your pain doesn't matter are 2 very different things. And then, unexpectedly, the truth arrived in the form of a grainy video file. A neighbor down the street had a security camera angled toward the shared driveway, close enough to catch a partial view through the kitchen window during the argument. When the case moved forward, that footage surfaced. It showed everything with a clarity no one could argue against. My sister grabbing my arm, my sister blocking the doorway, refusing to let me pass, my sister shoving me hard enough that I never stood a chance of catching my balance, and at no point, not once, did I touch her. I hadn't raised a hand. I hadn't shoved back. I had simply tried to leave a room, and for that, I had been hurt in a way that would follow me for the rest of my life. The investigation, once quiet and routine, suddenly had teeth. My sister's story collapsed under the weight of video evidence that didn't care about family loyalty or golden child status. The same relatives who had flooded my inbox with accusations went quiet. Nobody apologized for the things they'd said, but the silence itself was its own kind of confirmation. The case went to court. My sister sat there, dressed carefully, speaking softly, asking for forgiveness. She talked about stress. She talked about anxiety. She talked about the pressure of being the oldest child, of feeling like she'd never lived up to expectations. The judge listened, but the judge had also seen the footage, had read the medical reports detailing torn ligaments and a fracture requiring surgical intervention, and was not swayed by a performance dressed up as remorse. In the end, because it was her first offense, there was no jail time. But there was probation, mandatory anger management courses, community service, an order to pay restitution for my medical costs, a protective order keeping her a legal distance from me. It wasn't everything, but it was something. It was the first time in our entire lives that someone outside our family had looked at what she'd done and called it what it actually was. My father, even after all of it, even after the video, even after the court's ruling, found a way to make it my fault. He called me not long after the sentencing, his voice tight with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, and he told me, "You could have stopped this." I didn't raise my voice, I didn't cry, I simply said, "She could have stopped when she decided not to push me." He didn't have a response to that. There wasn't one to give. I cut contact with my family after that call, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, deliberately, the way you'd close a door you finally understood needed to stay shut. I moved to another city, somewhere with no shared history, no relatives 2 streets over ready to remind me of my supposed failures as a daughter and a sister. I continued physical therapy for my wrist, slow, frustrating sessions that reminded me daily of what had been taken from me. I built friendships with people who checked in on me not because they needed something, but because they cared. I started therapy of my own, not for my wrist this time, but for the 27 years of conditioning that had taught me my pain was less important than someone else's comfort. It took a long time to undo that. In some ways, I'm still undoing it. Nearly 2 years passed. I had built a life that felt, for the first time, entirely my own. And then my phone rang, an unfamiliar number that turned out to be my father calling from a new cell phone. I almost didn't answer. Something made me pick up. He wasn't calling to apologize. I want to be clear about that because for one foolish second, some small hopeful part of me thought maybe, finally, this was it. It wasn't. He was calling to ask for money. My sister had violated the terms of her probation. There were new legal fees. My parents were drowning under the cost of cleaning up after her yet again. And in their minds, I was still the solution to every problem this family had ever created for itself. I thought about the kitchen floor. I thought about the cold tile against my cheek and the crack of my own bone and my father's whisper in my ear, the very first words he'd said to me while I lay there in agony. "Don't tell the police. She has her whole life ahead of her." "You told me she had her whole life ahead of her," I said quietly. "Then let her live it." And I hung up the phone. For the first time in my life, I chose myself over a family that had never once chosen me. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt quieter than that, steadier, like setting down something heavy I hadn't realized I'd been carrying since I was 6 years old. My wrist still aches sometimes, especially in the cold, a permanent reminder of that night. But it's also a reminder of the moment I stopped absorbing the damage meant for someone else. The moment I finally understood that loving your family does not mean accepting abuse from them, and that protecting someone else's future should never come at the cost of destroying your own. Sometimes the hardest person to protect is yourself. I learned that lesson on a kitchen floor with a broken wrist and a father who chose his golden child over his own daughter's pain. But I carry that lesson with me now every single day, and I will never again let anyone whisper me into silence.